Hello, lovely to be back, and at a time when mental health has had so much publicity, with the young royals getting behind it. In the 18 years I've been working on All in the Mind, this is the first time I've noticed mentions of mental health everywhere. First today, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, a condition involving impulsivity, hyperactivity and real difficulties concentrating. We tend to think of it as starting in childhood and then persisting. In fact, some people grow out of it as they become adults, and it's been discovered very recently that it can start in adulthood too. The comedian and impressionist Rory Bremner, who's just been diagnosed with ADHD himself during the filming of an episode of BBC Two's Horizon, came to join us in the All in the Mind studio, along with Dr. Jessica Agnew-Blaze and Professor Jonna Kunze, both researching ADHD at King's College London. I asked Rory whether his symptoms began as a child or as an adult.
Well, I wasn't really aware of it, I suppose. That's the thing, because you kind of have a projecting, looking back on childhood. It's difficult not to project the person you are now onto your childhood. But certainly, I mean, my mother called me scatty. That was always my thing. So for being scatterbrained, I was forgetful. I was impulsive. I was irrepressible. I was a bit of a show-off at school, and school reports suggest that. And at university, I can remember, I hated pauses in seminars. I was always jumping in and things like that. And that's all behaviour that I recognise now, from what I know, is sort of classically symptomatic of ADHD. So how much I'm rewriting, because I have spoken to friends who said, no, I didn't really notice that. But certainly in adulthood, I've noticed that, I can concentrate, and I couldn't do what I do without being able to concentrate in large periods of time. But also, I couldn't do what I do without having the ADHD, which allows me to make those jumps and those leaps. So it is my best friend and my worst enemy at the same thing.
So is it obvious to you that what's happening in your mind is different from what's happening to a lot of other people?
Yes, I think it is. I think the key thing about ADHD is where it impairs your ability to function or to have stable and fulfilling relationships and good working relationships. It's where it impairs that, where there are people out there who are finding it difficult day to day because on a daily basis this condition is overwhelming them.
So, Jonna, for Rory, some of these symptoms have continued into adulthood. Will everyone who has ADHD as a child still have it in adulthood?
No, some of them seem to grow out of the disorder in the sense that they no longer in adolescence or in young adulthood obtain the full diagnosis. Some of them may still show some impairment and some symptoms, but they may not get the full diagnosis. And so not everyone, but we don't really have a full agreement yet as to what the percentage of individuals who have childhood ADHD will still show with the full ADHD diagnosis in adulthood.
And is it that the condition has gone away for some people, or that they've learnt to cope with it so well that now they don't show up on as a diagnosis of ADHD if you test them?
Well, we know that there are strong genetic risk factors underlying ADHD, and so those won't have changed. But something else may have changed. So we have looked at this at the level of the brain function. So we have looked at, do the brains of those whose ADHD has improved, do they look different to those who still persist with their disorder? And we do find some differences.
And is there any way of predicting yet who is going to grow out of it, if you like? Because I'm sure there's people wondering whether their symptoms are going to subside as they get into their 20s or 30s. Or do you have no idea who's going to grow out of it?
It's very difficult to predict at an individual level, but we do know at the group level of some factors. So in our follow-up study we found, and there's other studies that report quite similar findings, we found, for example, that lower IQ predicts persistence at the group level, and socioeconomic disadvantage, and also if the children with ADHD have other problems which are common in individuals with ADHD, such as anxiety, are more likely to continue with that.
And Jessica, you've done work looking at what happens when people go from childhood to adulthood, and you've actually published work suggesting that for some, ADHD is actually starting in adulthood. I mean, this is a really new idea, isn't it? Interesting idea.
Yes, definitely. So in our study, we interviewed participants when they were 18. And then because it's a prospective cohort study, so we've been following them since childhood, we were able to look back at childhood assessments of ADHD. So reports from mums and teachers when they were 5, 7, 10, 12. And one thing that was surprising that we found was that amongst those who had ADHD at age 18, when we looked back, over 2/3 didn't seem to meet criteria for the disorder at any of those childhood assessments.
And is that surprising? We've already heard how there is a genetic component, so you'd think that there would have been symptoms earlier. Is it just that people weren't diagnosed like Rory wasn't?
Right, so this was surprising. So as you mentioned, it could be these individuals had ADHD in childhood, but people didn't notice. We also considered that maybe individuals had some symptoms of ADHD, but when you're a child, you're in a family environment, you have this scaffolding around you. So you have your parents reminding you to do your homework or bring your lunch money. But once you leave the family environment and young adulthood and you have to organize all of these things for yourself, they may start to impair your life.
But of course there are other studies as well, aren't there? I mean, this is one of 3 studies, and in New Zealand they were looking at people who were a bit older as well.
Yes, the individuals were 38 when they were assessed. And interestingly, in that group, they find an even higher proportion of the adult ADHD population that's accounted for by late onset. So I believe in that study, it was around 90% of individuals with adult ADHD did not appear to have the disorder in childhood.
That's a huge number.
Yes.
But that means there could be masses and masses of adults out there with ADHD who don't know it, if these numbers are reflected more generally.
Yes, I think so. And I think there's a lot more research to be done.
Do their brains look different?
I don't think we know. We don't know yet. And so it's very new, this idea that late onset ADHD can even exist. It used to be that if someone said, I didn't really have this as a kid, people would say, then it's not ADHD. So I think understanding more about whether their brains look different, whether they perform differently on these cognitive tasks, is something that can be investigated in the future. One
challenge we have as researchers when we do this developmental work on ADHD is thinking how it changes how we diagnose ADHD with individuals of different age. So with children, it's based on parent report or parent and teacher report. So we interview them, and that's how the diagnosis is made. When we then look at adults, most commonly, in most studies, it's based on self-report. And there's a big difference in terms of the rates of persistence we see depending on who's reporting. And so the problem for the longitudinal studies, ours and all the other studies, is that often the person reporting on the symptom changes from childhood to adulthood.
Yes, so it's going to all depend on how you measure it and what questions you're asking and who you're asking.
Yes.
How you're doing it.
Yes.
It's interesting, talking about development, is that I think as people get older, my experience is that, you learn ways of coping with your ADHD. Obviously, the brain presumably is maturing. You'd know more about that than I would. But also people tend to find themselves possibly in lifestyles or in jobs where ADHD is actually an asset, certainly in my case. So, you find yourself in a job, naturally your creativity or your energy if you look at Michael Phelps, for example, or Simone Biles, we only found out that top gymnast had ADHD because of the TUE, the therapeutic use exemption certificates that were leaked out after the Olympics. We found out that she was on Ritalin. So these are high-performing people who've graduated naturally towards something where they excel. And so that sort of manages their ADHD because they're doing something in later life that as a child might have just been seen as being disruptive in the classroom because they had too much energy.
And when did you first suspect that there may be something different about you like this? I mean, you've only just had the official diagnosis, but you must have been wondering this for a while.
Yeah, a relative of mine was diagnosed with ADHD, and so I looked into it, and I met people who are associated with understanding it and organisations like the ADHD Foundation, and the more I looked into it, the more I realised the symptoms matched my own experience. But it was the more formal diagnosis, which is a little bit more overwhelming because so much of my life is about projecting success and confidence. But the diagnosis itself was about confronting those areas in your life where you were regularly and serially failing and breaking down. And that's a little bit hard to process.
And Jonna, Rory's obviously very successful and has made his ADHD work for him. But, I mean, there can be a huge range, can't there, of how it affects people in different ways. There are some estimates that perhaps 30% of the prison population might have ADHD. So for some people, it is having a huge impact on their lives, isn't it?
Yes, the rates of undiagnosed ADHD are very high in prisons. And so for some individuals, there are really severe consequences. And interestingly, also in relation to criminal offences, there's been a very large Swedish study where they showed that when people with ADHD, when they were on medication, the rates of criminal offences went down, and when they were off medication, the rates were higher. And so clearly medication can influence not just the ADHD symptoms, but some other adverse outcomes that are associated with the condition as well.
And yet there's also this finding that people with ADHD often have high IQs. So
That's right.
There's
a whole range of IQs, so a whole range from low to very high IQs. And We have actually found in our research, and some other groups reported as well, that IQ is very likely a protective factor. So individuals with higher IQ, they seem to be more responsive to treatment, and individuals with higher IQ are more likely to be able to compensate for the difficulties they are having, as Rory was saying earlier about potentially structuring their lives such that it fits the person they are.
And Rory, you've talked about the advantages and how you're able to use ADHD to help you in a way in your work. But what are the disadvantages for you? What are you having to fight?
Well, I think in terms of organisation, in terms of prioritising, I'm always taking on too much. I get overwhelmed by the amount of things I'm trying to do. I can't follow sort of complicated instructions. Mind wandering increasingly, and not sort of staying on task, of being too easily distracted when I'm supposed to be concentrating. But as I say, I'm very aware that my symptoms are mild, and it's more for those other. I mean, that 30% prison statistic is staggering, and you can very easily see the pathway of how that happens, because if you're a child and you're unable to control yourself or manage your behaviour in class, very easily, you can be excluded, and then you can fall in with a bad group of people. You self-medicate maybe, or you're in a group of people who are into drugs or misbehaving, and people talk about moving from classroom to courtroom, and it's a sort of spiral really, and it needn't happen. That's the extraordinary thing. That's why we've talked about adulthood, but early diagnosis is really helpful.
And there do seem to be still a lot of unanswered questions. Or what would you really like to know next?
I think we just don't really know enough about adults beyond maybe the early adulthood period that we are now starting to investigate, because adulthood ADHD is still only been recognised relatively recently. We don't have these follow-up studies into middle age and beyond, and so it's really would be so interesting to follow up individuals further.
And Rory, would you say that your symptoms are getting any worse or better as you get older, or is it just the
They
same?
seem to be getting worse, but that's because I'm thinking about it a bit more. I think that's part of it. But I mean, what's interesting is how the science is catching up, because it is a demonstrable and unidentifiable neurodevelopmental condition, and we can see in the brain what's going on, and I think that will really help the understanding.
So while you sit here having this discussion now, is your mind wandering to other things as well at the moment you're not talking, or even maybe while you are talking?
Yes, all the time, all over the place, and while other people are talking as well, I'm thinking, that's interesting, and other bits, like I'm noticing when you're making notes that your pen's going through the paper onto the thing. Oh God, who's going to clear up the felt underneath the table with? And
I've not made a mess, I promise.
No,
I promise. One of it's pencil. One of them's a pencil. Rory Bremner, Jessica Agnew-Blaze, and Yona Kunze there.